Hello and welcome back to Fixing Fallout 3, a series where we take the vanilla story of Fallout 3 and improve the world building and role-playing elements to make it the equal of some of the franchise's other titles. Last time we wrapped up a pretty open-ended questline that saw our player character tracking down leads to the location of their missing father. In Rivet City, we finally met someone with some answers, and we were able to narrow down his last known location to Vault 112, somewhere in the far southeast of the Capital Wasteland. Now, if you're at all familiar with Fallout 3 already, you'll know that in today's episode we're headed to Tranquility Lane, one of the most memorable set pieces in Fallout 3's story campaign. But hold on, our character doesn't actually know where that is yet. Not unless they already visited Vault-Tec HQ back during their first excursion into the DC ruins. Back then, this was just an optional dungeon that they could have stumbled across while they were rescuing the trapped Rangers in Vernon Square. But now it's obviously the next logical step to advance the story. I already covered this back in episode 4, so I'm not going to go over it again in much detail, but quick recap, I would leave this dungeon mostly unchanged. Activating the mainframe will give you the location of all nearby vaults, most of which have already been raided by the Enclave. The same mysterious force which raided Vault 101 back at the start of the game. The only 3 left showing any signs of activity are 112, 86, and 106. The last 2 we'll cover in the coming episodes, and the option is still open to track down these leads if the player is more interested in finding a Gek for the Brotherhood, or in rescuing the kidnapped dwellers of their vault than they are in finding their father. But for today, let's say that this is still the lead that they're most interested in investigating. In that case, they'll have to make their way back to DC to explore the Vault-Tec HQ. Or they'll have to backtrack to somewhere they've already been and set out towards Vault 112 if they know where it is already. This is a perfect chance to talk about fast travel mechanics, something I haven't really gotten a chance to cover yet in this series. Now, obviously, not having any sort of fast travel is untenable for a casual audience, even in a game released 16 years ago. But I think we can strike a more reasonable balance than the same old fast travel system that BGS has been using since Oblivion. Not to sound like a broken record, but I think we can take some inspiration from the classic games here. In Fallout 1 and 2, fast traveling included a real-time display of the player moving across the map, frequently interrupted by random encounters. These encounters could be mitigated by traveling for hire with a caravan, or in Fallout 2, by repairing the broken highwaymen. I already spoke about joinable caravan routes back in my videos about Megaton and the Wasteland, and obviously I won't be advocating for any kind of vehicle system for the rewrite, but I think that something as simple as a basic fast travel graphic, paired with the random encounter system, would drastically improve the experience of fast travel. Seriously, I think this is something that was completely aced back in the classic games. Now, I'm no game designer, and I don't know how hard this would be to implement in a fully open world, as opposed to Fallout 1 and 2's grid structure, but for our purposes, let's just say that fast travel will work just like it did in the classic games, with the only change being that the player can't fast travel to a place that they haven't already discovered. So before we head to Tranquility Lane, I want to talk a bit about some side locations that we're likely to encounter along the way. We've really been full speed ahead on the main story for the last few episodes, and yet just last time, I dropped the new version of this big beautiful map, with some pretty glaring differences from Fallout 3's vanilla map. So let's pump the brakes and find out how the side content is being altered by this transformation as well. Our first stop on the I-95 South is Alexandria. We get to see a little bit of this place in Fallout 3, but it doesn't really have any identity, separate from the rest of the West DC ruins. To change this, I want to alter 2 locations. The first is Alexandria Arms. In the vanilla game, this is just an apartment complex with some raiders to fight, but given the name, it obviously made me think of something like the Gunrunners in Fallout New Vegas. Which is interesting because there's really no equivalent in Fallout 3. I mean, there's Moira and Flak and Shrapnel in Rivet City, but that's about it. And that's understandable because Fallout 3's weapon diversity is significantly lower than New Vegas's. but I still think that a dedicated weapon shop would be a much more unique use for this location. It answers any questions of weapon production, as opposed to a gun economy filled entirely with scavenged wrecks, and it would add some much needed culture to the world. Second is the Arlington Library. Now, the obvious connection here is the Library of Alexandria. I don't want to get too gimmicky with it, but I think we can do a lot more with this location. In the vanilla game, you can help the Brotherhood clear out some mutants here, but I think it would actually be a lot more interesting if this was home to a more unique sub-faction, with more interactions besides just an unmarked quest to trade pre-war books for caps. Instead, I want to take some inspiration from some Fallout 2 cut content here. A cut location designed by none other than Tim Kaine, the father of Fallout himself, included a faction of non-Brotherhood monks who religiously collected and protected a cache of pre-war knowledge. Anything they could get their hands on. Books, blueprints, any sort of media. This is a pretty direct homage to A Canticle for Leibowitz, a post-apocalyptic sci-fi novel which was an inspiration to many of the designers at Interplay, while they were crafting the tone for the world of Fallout. This occupation would naturally lead them into conflict with the Brotherhood, and the player would ultimately have to help the monks defend their independence or remain neutral in the conflict, with the Brotherhood inevitably appropriating the collected knowledge after putting the monastery to the torch. This is actually a theme that they attempted to pay homage to multiple times. The other notable example that I can think of are the Ciphers, a tribal group from Interplay's cancelled Fallout 3, with the same technological MO. But I think we can finally do this homage justice in Bethesda's Fallout 3. I mean, where better to locate it than in the post-apocalypse's version of the Library of Alexandria? Perhaps a faction of monks inhabits the library, predating the Brotherhood's arrival in the capital wasteland. We can keep the quest where you help them clear out the super mutants, but let's also add some follow-up interactions where the player helps defend the library, possibly from an outcast shakedown. This could lead to the outcasts becoming hostile to the player if they aren't able to handle things diplomatically. And the questline would culminate much later in the plot, as the player eventually negotiates protection for the library from their faction of choice that's taking over administration of the capital wasteland. Further south down the I-95 is historic Mount Vernon, famously the home of George Washington. I didn't mention the Capitol Preservation Society when I covered Rivet City in the last episode, and that's because I think this would be a more unique location for that kind of gimmicky faction. This is where the player picks up the quest to
steal the Declaration of Independence.
And instead of the Capitol Preservation Society being just one guy's passion project, in our rewrite it'll be a much larger force with armed security and more members and donors scattered throughout various communities, with planned expeditions spanning up and down the eastern seaboard. You might wonder, who exactly are the mysterious donors giving a historical society of all things the firepower to run such a large operation? Needless to say, but the answer is obvious, and we'll return here later. Our final stop on the route south is Andale, which we're giving the usual upgrade treatment. Plenty more NPCs besides just the one family. Plenty of vendors, and plenty of caravan traffic passing through. Remember, our version of Andale is one of the major I-95 trading settlements. One that, as we'll learn, has somewhat of a foreboding reputation. During daylight hours, Andale is as good as a place as any to stop in for a quick run to the market or to water up a caravan's pack animals. But any traveling merchant that you meet will warn you to stay well away from Andale at night. Most would prefer to press on to the next town, or avoid Andale entirely by taking the wider route past Manassas, even if that means risking a trek through Raider territory. There are dark rumors about the fate of those desperate or careless enough to accept the hospitality of Andale for an overnight stay. Yeah, cannibals. They're cannibals. We've all played Fallout 3 before, we know where this is going. People are getting H.H. Holmes'd in Andale at night. But even more interesting, the merchants in-world already know this. It's basically an open secret that the whole town of Andale are a not-so-secret community of cannibals. But this is tolerated because the cannibals usually limit themselves to singular victims. And as mentioned before, Andale controls the most convenient route north into the capital wasteland, providing a daytime guarantee of security for passing merchants. This is a textbook example of unrestricted free market trade, enabling some pretty appalling practices for the sake of convenience. Recently though, a war between the three Virginian city-states of Richmond, Norfolk, and Broken Banks has constricted trade from the south, leading the cannibals to step up attacks on the few stragglers making their way through town. So if the player stops in Andale for the night, they're almost guaranteed to be attacked. Now, this could have a few different outcomes. Like the vanilla game, if the player is a cannibal, they could agree to keep the secret and join in on the nighttime proclivities themselves. Alternatively, they could escape and seek refuge with the nearby squad of Brotherhood outcasts. They become pretty interested in Andale since there's a traveling energy weapons merchant who's been staying in town. This is the guy who will sell you RL3 if you got the caps. And if you give the outcasts proof that the people of Andale are all cannibals, they'll have all the cautious belly they need to wipe out the town of degenerates wholesale. With the side effect that all the traveling merchants will hate you in the future for disrupting the southern trade routes. Besides this, wiping out the town might actually be a pretty morally gray choice, because there are plenty of children and innocent traders in town who will inevitably get caught in the crossfire. Unlike in the vanilla game, there's no happy ending here, where the player kills all the cannibals while the old man and the children go on to live a better life. Even if you do find a way to somehow spare them, with no income or means of providing food, the survivors will eventually starve to death or have to abandon the town, leading to the same outcome. Traveling west, we'll pass Girdershade, where we'll pick up the Nuka-Cola Quantum quest. Plus, the Nuka-Cola plant is nearby. The Quantum Mirelurks are cute, but I think a cooler use of this location would be as a functioning mint. I mean, new bottle caps need to come from somewhere, right? And finally, Evergreen Mills, if we haven't visited already. Okay, next stop, Tranquility Lanes. That's right, I said lanes. Peep this concept art. I think Vault 112 being located under a destroyed bowling alley would be a heck of a lot more interesting than plain old Smith Casey's garage. Maybe the location was changed to make it a lot more inconspicuous, so that the player doesn't accidentally stumble into the vault before working their way through the main questline. But with the larger map in our rewrite, I think we can get away with this. So inside, the player will eventually find the entrance to the vault, and I think we can keep the general vibe here. The place is totally abandoned, and yet well maintained. Couple things I would change here. First, I would add many more recreation pods, similar in design to those seen in the concept art. And instead of plain old RoboBrains, I think a thinner design closer to this concept art would make a more lasting impression. I also think we should address just why the player is let into the vault so easily in the first place. It might initially seem like the robots are malfunctioning, mistaking the player for an overdue resident, but if you hesitate to enter the pod, you might find the act quickly dropped. Turns out, Stanislaus Braun has more control on the outside than it would initially seem, and he intentionally leaves the vault security deactivated to help entice unsuspecting victims into entering the simulation, becoming the latest playthings in his twisted nightmare. Also, I think it could be really cool if we adapt another cut concept from Van Buren here. In that game, the rogue AI Odysseus, administrator of the Tibbetts prison complex, would have dispatched robot hunters into the wasteland to collect and incarcerate prisoners. This is presumably how the player character was originally captured, and they would continue to hunt the player throughout the events of the campaign. The adaptation is obvious here. All those RoboBrains wandering throughout the capital wasteland, they're bronze collection agents, using their built-in mesmetron attack to subdue unsuspecting prey, collecting them to become the newest victims of Tranquility Lane. This doesn't add all that much to the world, and unlike Van Buren, we aren't really working this directly into the plot, unless we're feeling really bold, and being killed by a RoboBrain out in the wasteland automatically starts the Tranquility Lane quest, regardless of how far we progress the story. But it does add some much needed intentionality behind the various threats wandering around the capital wasteland. Additionally, I'd like to clean up the lore of Stanislaus Braun a little bit. He's credited not only as the inventor of the Gek, but also as a software genius who conceptualized the idea of the VR simulation pods. Vanilla Fallout 3 places much more of an emphasis on the Gek at this point in the story. Braun, being its inventor, makes it obvious why Liam Dadson went looking for him in the first place. But to fit in more neatly within our rewrite, I would actually change this so that Braun was instead the AI programmer who developed the Zax algorithm. This may not seem significant at first, but I think it could actually do some pretty heavy lifting to help set up some of the threat of the main antagonist that we introduced in the last episode. His expertise might provide some eye-opening insight on the potential of a Zax system becoming self-aware. This probably won't mean much to a first-time player, as they obviously haven't met John Henry Eden yet, but it'll be very important for a returning player, or one who's already beginning to put the pieces together. And I mean, if Braun was the one who created Zax, maybe there's a reason why he's been hiding in this virtual world for 185 years. Maybe he's scared of his own creation. And the final thing I would add here is a contingency for returning players who don't want to go through the whole Tranquility Lane sequence on a repeat playthrough. Maybe instead they head up to the Overseer's office and dispatch Braun before ever entering the simulation. Or perhaps they hacked one of the terminals and they found out what pod their father was hooked up to, managing to unlock it preemptively. Either of these scenarios would make this sequence much less of a hassle for people trying to speedrun the game. But entering the simulation, we want things to go pretty much the exact same way. Seriously, I know that so far we've altered almost every sequence in the main campaign, so this might come as a bit of a shock, but I actually think that this quest is pretty excellently designed. I can't think of any major changes or additions that wouldn't end up subtracting from the overall experience. I wasn't kidding last episode when I said that this is my favorite sequence in all of Fallout 3. And you might have noticed already that most of this episode has been fluff, because I don't actually have all that much rewriting to do when it comes to the main topic of today's video. But what we can do while we're here is talk about why the sequence is great, because it conforms to the basic game design philosophy that I've been trying to reinforce throughout this entire series, better than any other sequence in Fallout 3. So first off, I love how BGS does a lot with little in this quest. You're basically going up against a literal cyber deity, and yet the mere implications of Braun's power in this world is enough to make resistance against his charade absolutely futile. It would be easy to imagine this devolving into a gimmicky boss fight or a cheesy scripted escape sequence, but it doesn't, and I can really appreciate this restraint. Sometimes it's better to hold back and let implication do the heavy lifting. As I was writing this script, I kept thinking about all the possibilities that Braun has as an antagonist, and yet the more I thought about it, I think doing anything more would really ruin the strong impression that he leaves. I think maybe a couple of Betty cameos outside the simulation would be cool, just to give Braun a little more relevance outside of this one instance. It's about the only thing I could think to add that would be tactful. Okay, secondly, I like how the quest design leaves it up to the player whether they want to play along for a chance at escape, or engage with the level design and the NPCs to find another solution. This whole series, I've been talking about how this kind of quest design reinforces the karma system in a positive way, utilizing it as a tool to encourage player engagement. And this is the best example of this in all of Fallout 3. Every quest in the game should have been designed this way. And if you do take the time to unravel the mystery, talking to every NPC and actually puzzling it out for yourself, Braun's downfall is immensely satisfying. It's also a pretty bittersweet fate for those trapped in the simulation. There's no happy ending here, where you rescue them all from the nightmare. You can only give them freedom and death. It helps make this sequence one of the most unique, terrifying, and thought-provoking quests that BGS has ever added to the world of Fallout. But here we are. Exiting the pod, we finally get to meet the man, the myth, the legend, Liam Dadson in the flesh. The guy we've been looking for all game. This is a huge reveal. Remember, in our rewrite, our character never grew up with Dad in the vault, so we have no idea who this man is. We only know that he's somehow crucial to unraveling the mystery of why Vault 101 was raided by the Enclave. who we are, and why we were abandoned as an orphan to live out the rest of our days in the insular ecosystem of the tyrannical control vault. But speaking to him, it's not the reception that you would expect. In Fallout 3, Liam Dadson has been trapped in Tranquility Lane for a few days. Weeks to months at most, depending on how long your character takes to reach that point in the story. The time difference is honestly inconsequential. But in our rewrite, it's been 18 years. Over a decade and a half of constant psychological torture in a simulated nightmare. The man you meet exiting the simulation isn't the calm and collected Liam Dadson that you know from Fallout 3. He's a little bit, well, cracked. And your first challenge is to talk him down and convince him that he's been rescued from the simulation at all. He probably still thinks that this is one of Braun's tricks, and he comes out ready to fight. This speech check should be pretty easy, given that the rest of the story relies on its success. But I still think it would be really, really funny if you could fail, causing him to become hostile and forcing you to kill him. The next hurdle is to try and convince him of who you are. This is much easier because he probably knows more about you, or at least where you come from, than you do yourself. And your relationship to him is too oddly specific for it to possibly be one of Braun's conjurations. But this is no time to talk. Braun held up his end of the deal, letting you escape from the simulation. But that doesn't mean he's willing to just let you go without a fight. He won't allow any mention of his little experiment to make its way out into the wasteland with you. Suddenly, the robot security turns on you, and you're forced to fight your way out of the vault. This is easier than it would seem. Punished Liam Dadson is a surprisingly capable fighter. This take on the character might seem obvious given Liam Neeson's modern reputation for shitty European action movies, though it is a little anachronistic. Taken released in 2009, just a few months after Fallout 3, and the Liam Neeson of this era was more known for his more stoic and reserved roles as Oscar Schindler or Qui-Gon Jinn than he was for hamming it up in B-movie schlock. So I can understand why BGS went the route that they did with this character. That being said, I just couldn't resist, and I think his new backstory will more than provide for the darker character traits. We'll get to that in a sec. But between the two of you, you're able to fight your way up to the surface easily enough. But it's not over yet. Braun has activated his surface agents. A legion of robo-brains and sentry bots are bearing down on you. So the two of you make your way to the nearest radio tower. You hold off waves of hunters bearing down on you, while Liam Dadson works on setting out an SOS signal. Eventually, he gets through. He's managed to get his old colleague, Dr. Lee, on the line. All he has to do is drop his name, and she's dispatching a Brotherhood vertibird to your position. You and Liam Dadson fend off the last waves together, until the vertibird arrives and extracts you. You've escaped. The nightmare is over. But this is not the last we'll be seeing of Stanislaus Braun. Okay, so that was a thing. Right, time to debrief. So far, I've shied away from adding too many cinematic action sequences, because I know that these can be a real headache to script in the creation engine. But I included this one because we need something to build up some kind of chemistry between Liam Dadson and the player. So far, we've offered far less of a connection than vanilla Fallout 3, even with the possibility of killing him during your first interaction. But without that arduous intro sequence, we need something to get the player familiarized with James. Something that will be able to adequately impress the importance that this character will have going forward. And just who is Liam Dadson anyway? Fallout 3 doesn't give us much, and we've been even sparser in the rewrite so far. Time for an exposition dump. As the vertibird spirits you away towards Jefferson Island, with the doors down if we're feeling bold, you get the long-awaited explanation from your father. Settle in, this one's a doozy. You might have guessed already, but Liam Dadson isn't from around here. A long time ago, in another part of the world, James was part of the very same faction that raided Vault 101. That's right, Liam Dadson was West Coast Enclave. Raised on the oil rig. Fed on a diet of propaganda since birth. They were told over and over of the righteousness of their cause. The Enclave was the last bastion of humanity on planet Earth. Their mission? A recolonization of their homeland, reclamation of the sea of irradiated wasteland from the race of subhuman tribal squatters that inhabited it. A second manifest destiny. Was a cute myth, one easily shattered by prolonged contact with outsiders. From his first deployment, James understood that everything he had ever been told was wrong. Sure, the wasteland makes a bad first impression, but beneath it all, the violence, the carnage, and the death, the spirit of humanity endured. A spirit of compassion, altruism, hope, but most of all, evolution. From his first deployment, James understood that the Enclave's mission would never succeed. Out of the decaying corpse of America had grown a new, vibrant ecosystem of culture, spreading all across the American continent. Few still remembered, or even cared, about the idea of America. It would take a genocide of unspeakable proportions to erase this new world, and that was something James could not condone. His breaking point came on July 20th, 2242, when his squad was dispatched to a tribal village called Arroyo. Its inhabitants were to become human chattel, fodder for the Enclave's ghastly FUV experiments. James maintains vehemently that he did not fire a single shot throughout the battle, so he could not have been the one that orphaned you. But amongst the carnage, a child. That's right, Liam Dadson is not your biological father, only a surrogate. He rescued you from the fate of the Arroyo tribals, hiding you in his backpack, already planning his defection. He could have never known that the survivors would be rescued, and the Enclave's destruction facilitated only weeks later by the Chosen One, the protagonist of Fallout 2. After the destruction of the oil rig, James's squad, including his partner Madison Lee, made their way by vertibird as far east as they could, walking the rest of the way. After trekking all the way across the country, most of James's squad had been killed. The only other defector remaining was Lee, and they were drawn to the last holdout of the East Coast Enclave out of habit, not knowing whether they were going to enlist or to help destroy their former compatriots. This was the purpose of the expedition, the one whose footsteps we retraced in the last episode. Depositing you in Vault 101, after making a secret pact with the Overseer to fix the faulty water chip, Liam Dadson and Madison Lee hired a team of mercenaries to help accompany them to the Enclave base in the Appalachian Mountains. But the group took unexpectedly heavy casualties while reaching it, meaning that Liam Dadson was the only one to ever discover the fate of the East Coast Enclave. You already know what happened afterwards from your interrogation of Harkness. Whatever Liam Dadson met up there in the ruins, it prompted him to flee to Vault 112, searching for any way that he could possibly combat this new terror. And that's where he's remained for the last 18 years. Okay, so some of you might be thinking, this is it. This is where we jump the shark, right? But I really don't think so. I mean, think about it. Liam Dadson and Madison Lee being Enclave is totally plausible. They're hardly given any backstory at all in the vanilla game, and this kind of background would explain the high level of technical acumen that they both have. Name-dropping the entire plot of Fallout 2 might be a little too much fan service, but that's exactly what we want right now. So far, Fallout 3, even in our rewrite, has been almost entirely disconnected from the entries that came before it, only really sharing a loose aesthetic, terminology, and bestiary. But this is where we bite the bullet and turn Fallout 3 from a loose reboot of the Fallout franchise to a proper sequel to what came before. Looking back, this conjoining of East and West Coast Fallout might seem a little tenuous, but my point here is that this division never needed to take place. With more attention to world building, BGS Fallout never had to be so disconnected from the roots of the series in the first place. And yes, this does totally imply that the Lone Wanderer is secretly the child of the Chosen One, but I don't think it's too much of a stretch, given the clues we've already laid out. I mean, the Chosen One already has bastard children like Mr. Bishop running around in canon anyway, so I don't think it's too much fan service to make this implication. And of course, this is something that we never have to confirm 100%. It could easily be untrue based on your own individual headcanon, but it will keep speculation going long after the game has already been released. Plus, Liam Dadson not being our character's biological father gives us so much more room for role-playing opportunity. Yeah, Fallout 3 gave us the option of being a hostile brat when we met him again, but interactions with him are extremely limited, given your family dynamic and its importance to the story. Is it any wonder why his reaction to his child being a murderous psychopath has become a meme at this point? By taking away the family dynamic and putting a 2-decade freeze on your relationship, it leaves us open to any sort of opinion about him that we want. Maybe we still feel a sort of familial reverence for him. I mean, he's Liam Neeson, for Christ's sake. He's awesome. Or maybe we hate him for abandoning us in the vault, for stealing us away from our home, for any number of reasons. Maybe he hates us. This new dynamic gives the player that option without the story hinging on it. Finally, the presence of the Enclave in other parts of the Wasteland is far easier to explain than the Brotherhoods, in my opinion. For our purposes, all we have to do is expand the scope of Enclave operations from the West Coast. Let's say that the plan for recolonization would have originally had 3 prongs. After the new plague was released from the oil rig, the West Coast Enclave would emerge onto the continent and drive east. The base in the Midwest would drive south along the Mississippi Delta, while the base outside DC would emerge and secure the weapon stockpiles in the Pentagon, driving north and south along the eastern seaboard, after the capital had been scoured of mutants. Although obviously, this plan never came to pass. The oil rig was destroyed, along with most of the West Coast Enclave. The Chicago Enclave emerged, only to find themselves almost instantaneously embroiled in a conflict with the ascendant Midwest Brotherhood of Steel. And the DC Enclave, well, they suffered the worst fate of all. But unfortunately, we'll have to leave that tale for another time, as our little reunion gets interrupted as the Vertibird touches down at Project Purity. We'll get plenty more opportunities to ask Liam Dadson, well, any question that we want in the future. But next time, we're hopping right into our introduction to Madison Lee and the Brotherhood of Steel. So that was it. That was my rendition of this little stretch of the Fallout 3 campaign. What did you think? Be sure to let me know in the comments, and go check out the previous installments if you want a clear picture of everything else we've changed to get here. The next installment will be out shortly, so don't forget to subscribe for that. And in the meantime, maybe check out some of my daily Fallout live streams, and stay tuned for some of my more short-form content. Bye-bye for now.